Alright, on to the other clan in the game that I think has changed the most since 1.0 till now, Hellhorned, and definitely for the better. This clan was by far my most hated clan in the game when I was first playing. It just seemed so weak, and I just didn't really get... a lot of that was to do with my misunderstandings of how to use a lot of the cards, but a lot of the cards just weren't as good, especially the banner units. I'm telling you, like, there's a lot of complaints, very warranted, about the current state of Umbra banner units, but I am adamant about this. The old Hellhorn banners were way worse. Way worse. The uncommon banners were such a joke. Yeah, we'll get into it here, but first things first, we got the uncommon tier, which doesn't have quite the amount of changes that the Melting Remnant uncommon tier had, but there's still a few here. Across the board, it's all buffs. There's definitely no nerfs. Vent, it's always been a good card. There's that moment you're learning the game when you realize a card like Vent is not that good on its own, but once you just put plus damage upgrades on it, you're like, oh, I can play this for 0, and it basically clears the floor. But definitely definitely back then, it destroyed anything in the game. 10 damage could kill anything in the game that was a backline or even a purifier. So that's all you needed. Like a 10, you could put 10 damage on it, hold it over, and all of your backline is cleared for the rest of the game. So Vent's always been good. It's probably worse now than it was back then. I still think it's a decent card, but it needs a bit more now. Like, you need to get like Divine Temple upgrades on it for it to be super relevant late game. But that's not too much of an issue. Fortify, I don't think Fortify's ever been good. I don't think it's good now. I don't think it was good then. I think rare decks can make use of it, especially after Apex Imp in particular was added. I think without Apex Imp, you're kind of relegated to using it as like a cheap incant card. I really don't think using it for its actual effect, especially back then, was worth it. Like, technically value-wise, it's fine. Like, 5 armor for 0 is like okay value, but this isn't really a game where cheap value makes much sense, because the fights just don't last long enough. You need higher impact cards, so I really don't think... I think Fortify has always been the worst uncommon, even worse than the original Ritual. We'll get to that at the end there. Fledgling Imp, kind of the mascot of the series, has always been Fledgling Imp. One of the first things you always see when you think of Monster Train, in my opinion, but I will say back then, I never really used the unit. Potentially it was fine. You can see it was weaker back then. Just as a unit, it did 3 rage instead of 5 rage. They upgraded it to 5 eventually. But more importantly, in the DLC, its essence gives 5 rage, which is pretty relevant. I mean, the ability to put down this imp and get 10 entire rage to your entire floor is pretty crazy. There's also nice reasons to flex it with other stuff too, like a Molten Encasement or even a Welder Helper. But I will say, its potential that it was an okay card originally, but I guess, like, it seemed more powerful to me back in the day to overstack a floor. So I really, especially like prior to Shardtail Queen, I rarely was running imps. And like I said, it's a potential that it was fine, but I don't know. With the ceiling being 3 rage for these imps, I'm not entirely convinced it was super powerful in a lot of decks. You really got to go wide to make use of it. I usually just, I don't know. It kind of falls into that Paraffin Enforcer territory where I feel like just the state of both my play and the game made it so I wasn't really looking for that unit. I don't know. There's not a whole lot more I can say about that. I wonder if there's a way I could like get a previous build of the game just to try out 1.0 again, see if it actually was good. Hidden Passage. This is a card that always was good, right? And like back then, I could argue it was the best uncommon in 1.0. You know, you could overstack a floor and not even have scaling cards, and that would often be enough to win a game if you just had decently statted stuff, right? Like, you could do things like stack 7 Lady of a Houses on a floor, for example, and if you have Hallowed Drippings, consume removed, sometimes that could just win a run. You didn't need much back then. You didn't need the crazy scaling that you have now. I think it's still a great card. It hasn't changed, obviously. I think I use it less. I think it's not so great with Shardtail Queen all the time. Generally, a self-infused Fledgling Imp on Endless is going to beat out any sort of overstack strategy, so if I have a Fledgling Imp, I'm going to be looking for that. But there's still a lot of combos and units that overstacking a floor with Hidden Passage works well with. You know, but we could get into that. It's not really the point of this video. We're just looking at changes, and you know, overall Hidden Passage itself never actually changed. It just probably is a little less useful now than it used to be, but still a very good card. Hornbreak's an interesting one. I never felt it was great back in 1.0 or even pre-DLC. Now I love it. Now it's like a really good card, I think. But obviously the only change that was made to this is it became twice as effective because it hits twice. But also just the keyword here, piercing, happens to be a million times more useful in the DLC than it did before. You know, pre-DLC, there wasn't much in the game that had, like, Spell Shield in particular, but even, like, Damage Shield, even, like, units that were armored up. I don't know. It, sorry. Choking to death here. I don't know. It didn't really benefit from damage the way it does now as well. You know, I guess it did. I mean, technically a +10 would make it kill any backliner, but also just vanilla, it killed any backliner that wasn't named Purifier. So I guess it was always okay, but you just, I don't know, when you look at here, like you can compare it directly to Vent and Molting Imp in that sense, and Vent and Molting Imp are just better in the 1.0 game, right? When almost every backliner has 5 or less health, other than a single backliner named Purifier. Vent and Molting Imp just outshine Hornbreak quite a great deal. Like, Hornbreak doesn't really add anything that those cards wouldn't. And on that note, Molting Imp, obviously, as a regular card, hasn't changed, but I will say it is significantly less useful in the DLC than it was back then. Back then, a Molting Imp was great. You know, I could put that on Endless. Shade Wings are taken care of. Everything other than Purifier is taken care of. Obviously, now there's the Essence, which is really good. The Essence is 15 damage to enemy units, which is interesting. It's good. It's just weird that the base unit didn't really have any glow up, but that's fine, I guess. But yeah, that's basically Molting Imp. What more is there to say? The flat AoE of 5 was just a nice magic number back then that killed everything. Was never too sad to see a Molting Imp. Maybe I still preferred Event though, just because I could play it for 0, and I didn't need to find Endless on it to have like replayability on it. Also, I don't know, I would never really put Endless on a Molting Imp unless it was Shade Wings and I really needed an answer. Torch hasn't changed at all. It's always just been an okay card. Maybe it was better pre-DLC because it was like the only card of the original 5 that you could target the back line with. The original 5 starter cards, I should say. And I guess target your own units as well, for that matter. So, yeah, I guess when I think back, Torch really actually was kind of one of the better starter cards. Potentially the best starter card. I think it was often talked about as the best starter card, and I can't necessarily disagree with that. But then, obviously, XO came out and And just the DLC World Torch is a lot less useful, I think. I still don't mind it, though. It's pretty useless in a lot of runs, though. Welder Helper. Welder Helper is it was always never a bad card. You can see here it gave less armor, 15. Gives more armor now. It has an essence that kind of goes to the whole floor. I feel like Welder Helper significantly got better once Shardtail Queen was released. It was an incredible card in the Shardtail. It was just kind of a god tier card to put on Endless. Because you could really carry a run with Shardtail then. Like, you could go Imperialist and flex, like, Rally. And, you know, back then you didn't really need multi-strike quite like you need it now on a unit like that. And, you know, you could get a ton of armor, clear the AoE, and get your one tank kill. Keep in mind, it wasn't really until rings 7 and 8 that you'd ever have to deal with significant health on 2 or more units in a wave, usually, back in 1.0. I don't find myself using it as much in the DLC. I think it's funny how, like, Fledgling Imp and Welder Helper pretty much hardcore reversed. Well, I don't know, all the imps kind of rotated in a fashion for me. Like, Molting Imp to me used to be in 1.0 the best imp, then Welder Helper became the best imp in the Friends and Foes update, and then Fledgling Imp became the best in the DLC. Welder Helper, I guess, was never the worst one, though. It's always been either the best or, like, second best. And then Ritual, as you can see here, was pretty sad back then. I do wonder if maybe it was okay, but I just never, ever took... Well, you know, you'd start with it, and it just always felt so underwhelming, especially when, like, we'll get to Dark Deal, but you see, like, Dark Deal never changed. Like, I would compare it to Dark Deal and be like, wow, I have to spend 3 to get less rage than I get for 0 with Dark Deal? What the fuck is this card? It never occurred to me until it got its final... It actually went through 2 different upgrades. It first got upgraded to Rage 8. People still weren't using it at that point. It was probably honestly fine at 8, but just the sour taste everyone had from the Rage 6 variant probably still had them not wanting to do it. And even when it got to Rage 10, I was still writing it off originally until I saw a run where Narninian was using it, and he kind of clued me into just how powerful the simple upgrading of it down to 1 Ember was. I do wonder if maybe even at Rage 6, beelining it down to 1 Ember might be okay in 1.0. But it's certainly, at least at that point in my journey of learning the game, it seemed like one of the worst cards in the game at Rage 6. Now it's one of the best cards in the game, I would say. It's still outclassed by Fledgling Imp, but it's definitely in most cases, the second most ideal card for me to see. It also, it doesn't require hitting Endless like Fledgling does. Like, Ritual will just always guaranteed to be good in any run. You can simply get it to 1. And you can always find also, like, temple upgrades to get it to 1, and then you can like double stack it at 2 or hold it over at 1. I don't even mind holding it over at 2 these days if the right run requires it, or not requires it, but can support it. You know, some runs it's not good to do that, but you know, if you don't have much else to play, 2-cost Ritual and holdover's fine. But yeah, that's the commons. They were never amazing, but they're pretty great now. Yeah. Now we're on to the uncommons. Now I open a box, so the text hasn't changed, but the card has changed. It was more powerful back then. I think it's still a fine card, but the fact of the matter is you used to be able to find Transcend Imp and Impish Scholar quite a lot more often from it. And there was a certain point in the game where they did nerf the probabilities of both of those cards from coming out of it. Both of that and Imp Sickle got the same treatment there. So, you know, you used to be able to rely on it decently to, like, you could consume remove it and spam it ever so often in a run, and you could count on it almost always kind of giving you a Transcend Up at some point. Definitely not the case now. I think I had one run shortly after that nerf that really showcased how low the chance is. Like, I had like a spell chain, consume remove, Imp in a Box, like Hell Vented, and I went like I played it like 100 times in a run and I never got to transcend them. You'll still get it every now and then, but it's quite rare. Important Work technically got nerfed, but it's still just an amazing card. Back then I didn't really use it though. I dare I say also in 1.0, I didn't realize the power of imps, so I wasn't personally using Imp in a Box, even though it was a very good card. I think Important Work definitely became a lot better after Shardtail Queen. I think Shardtail Queen really opened up a lot of imp stuff. And yeah, it was pretty wild that you could gain 2 Ember back then. Imagine that now. It's still a god tier card. Rage Serum's never changed, though I guess in relation to like Ritual and to a certain degree Fledgling Imp, it seemed better in 1.0 at least. Like now it's just like, ugh, Rage Serum. Why would I ever add this to a deck, right? But back then I would add it every now and then. I'm like, okay, I'll just add it. It never felt great at any point, but it just seemed like a low investment card. It's kind of like Fortify, but I think the value of Reach 3 is quite a lot more than 5 armor. Still not great though. It's usually just like a supplement to a you know, already existing rage strategy. You usually only take it when you're in a desperate spot, I feel. You know, you can do nutty stuff like consume remove it and whatnot. It's not a horrible repeater target either. I've used it with repeater to some success. Branded Warrior, the unit has not changed at all. The funny thing is, like now, the essence is pretty nice. I think it's not a super desirable essence in a lot of cases, but it's particularly good on a sweeper. It can be okay on a Thorn Hollow if you can make use of the floor. You can do weird stuff like put a Molten Imp into it and put on an Endless. That's pretty memey though. That's not going to be better than just doing it with a Fledgling Imp. But some runs, I guess you can make it work. I've done it like once. Funny thing is though, you know, well, you start to look at the, like I had mentioned, the uncommon banners for Hellhorn just sucked. And Branded Warrior was probably, arguably, the best uncommon banner back then. You know, it technically at least had a pretty good utility, unlike any of the other ones. It took a lot of finessing, though, to get that. Like, it took a lot of work to get it to actually work. And similar to, like, Fledgling Up, I don't know how good, like, wide scaling was back then. Certainly on an overstacked floor, though, if you could get a bunch of, like, large stone branded warriors with quick, that was usually pretty good. Get a Gurg's Goad for... Gurg's Goad, it's always just been a pretty good card with, but, yeah, it's not... It doesn't have great stats. It's hard to get the Slay consistently off in some runs. But, yeah, nowadays you hardly ever use the unit as... you're usually just taking it for the essence, right? And probably it's a rough run if you're considering using its essence. You probably missed on Fledgling Imp, you probably missed on Ritual Battle, and now you're trying to make the essence work somehow. But the unit is unchanged. It's always been Rage 4, 10-5, apply 3 on Slay. I feel like they could at least glow up the Slay on this unit. They could keep the essence still at 3, but maybe give like 5 Rage on Slay. Might give it at least some reason to have. Like, it should at least match what Fledgling got buffed to, right? Still wouldn't be that taken of a unit at that point. But, you know, in 1.0, I remember Paraffin Enforcer did Rage 2 on Strike. I think it should at least get more on Slay than a Paraffin Enforcer gets on Strike, right? That would make sense to me. Anyway, though, Horned Warrior, this unit just kind of sucked. So interesting. Like, I wonder what... They must have tested a lot, because it's so funny, because when I first saw the rework, right? I looked at Horned Warrior and I was like, whatever, I guess maybe it'll be like slightly better, but it still seems just bad. Like, why don't I just get Animus of Will, right? Turns out this is one of the best reworks ever for anything, any card in this game, of just turning it from a pretty useless card into a very takeable card. 15 by, you know, it essentially has the same overall stats, right? It does 15 by 2 now instead of 30 single strike. So vanilla it does the same, but obviously it gains quite a lot more once you start scaling it. And then it just got up to 5 health. It was always weird that it was at 4 anyway. I don't know why it wouldn't have just been at 5. But yeah, it was just a boring 0 utility unit. Just a, like, why would this ever be good, right? It strikes once, it has no health. Damage isn't even, like, amazing. Doesn't really benefit from anything. Always been a cool looking unit though, I've always liked the look of it. At that amount of health though, I have to imagine these are popcorn muscles. But yeah, super great rework. And I also think it's one of the most fair multi-strike infusions. It really only has specific units that it works well with, and I think that's generally a good thing. I don't necessarily love... I'm fine with essences that are kind of mediocre and are applicable to like every unit, but for the strong essences, I don't love the ones that are just sort of applicable to all units. I think that they should be really only strong with certain units, and that's what Horned Warrior is. It's really strong with like a Rail Beater, really strong with something that might have like damage shield or whatnot. But yeah, really good rework on Horned Warrior. I think that's one of the best reworks I've seen in any card game. Such a simple one too. Impish Scholar never changed. I would say though that consumes in general have gotten better. Not really as cards, just Last Stand, for example. We'll get to that one. Like I didn't think it was like super needed. Seemed like very win more in the original base game, but now it's like very, very good in the DLC. So like I think a lot of consumes just got better, so Impish Scholar by nature got better. Impressive has never impressed me. The only thing that changed is they add a tune to the keyword. I've hardly ever used it for like an actual damage source. That seems weird to me. Though that being said, maybe I would like a world where this card could be useful as like an attune to damage card, because you don't really see that with imps. Because to me, if you have a good imp, if you had the like imps on Endless, which is the only way I think this would be worth keeping in a deck, you kind of are in a good spot anyway. And you wouldn't do like an Endless vanilla Queen's Imp, for example, just to make this card work. So I don't know, it's just kind of a weird card, but I'll take it every now and then if I'm mainly Queen's Imp secondary and I don't have good ways to kill my imps. Martial Shields, nothing's ever changed on this card. I do think it was significantly better though back then, because just stacking some defense on a tank in general was better, but more importantly, it was just really useful for overstack strategies, and I think overstack strategies were quite a lot more just default back then. I mean, honestly, when I think of Hellhorn 1.0, my mindset usually was like arguably Hidden Passage was the strongest card in my mind at the time. Might not have been true, but that's kind of how it seemed. So like, March of Shield was just like the companion card for that, a way to get the proper frontliner to the front, because you couldn't always get your draw order to cooperate with you, right? But Martial Shields kind of corrected that. Pirate Chomper is an interesting one. I never ever really took it 1.0 or pre-DLC. I only really take it now if I'm running Volatile Gauge, or if I have a Transcendent and I need some help for it. For that, it's great, but otherwise, you know, I never really... It's a weird card, because, like, it'd make more sense if it was a spell of some sort, because then you could put Permafrost on it. Maybe the idea is that you Permafrost a spell that you're supposed to use with it. I guess that makes sense, but as it's like you know, comboing it with, say, a Spike the Hellhorn or a One-Horn Tome, I think was probably the original intent of this card, but turns out we just hardly ever use it for that, right? Then Rail Beater, here's a weird one. Stat-wise, it got a buff. It gets 5 more armor now. Ooh-wee. It's actually pretty good. But More importantly, again, like the Horn Warrior, amazing rework. Now the essence has never been great. It's still usable, armor 30, but particularly just the strike effect. Like Railbeater, I almost never wanted its effect to go off. It just almost always was never a positive for your deck, because like I assume you're frontlining with this unit as a tank, and why would you want to push the tank to the back and then have your heavy hitting backliner hit squishy? It just doesn't make sense. You're basically just ensuring that the tank goes up to the pyre with like full health. There are every now and then waves where it might make sense to do it on, but to have it apply to every single strike is just a nightmare to deal with. It was in my opinion, it was a horrible fucking unit. Arguably worse than like I don't know anything, but like now it's arguably the best uncommon potentially in the game. Definitely in the Hellhorned, it's the best uncommon, and it's funny because like I don't know, everybody still seems to sleep on like the current version of Railbeater. People, I'll watch people play and they're like, oh yeah, like you know, but they're pretty good players, right? Like I'm not trying to throw shade or anything, but it's like in my head I know how good Railbeater is. I have like the proof positive in the pudding of how many times I've been able to, like it is by far my most winning unit in the game for banner units, and it just seems like people aren't that excited to get a Railbeater. And I'll admit, like, not every run needs a Railbeater. Not every run needs any particular unit in the game all the time, but most runs honestly could use a Railbeater, and it can fill any role in the game. You don't have to have it be the carry. It can just be a tank that literally cuts your Relentless rounds in half sometimes. Or it could even just be a utility unit that, again, just cuts your Relentless or wave. Just helps with wave clear. Melee weakness, like think about how strong Sunderstone is, right? Well, you just get that by default with Railbeater. It's also the best unit to put a one-horn tome on, and obviously the best unit to put a horned warrior into. So yeah, Railbeater, probably the best rework in the game, along with Horn Warrior, and we'll get to it here in a millisecond. Steelworker. And it's funny because this rework, I always thought this is how it should work, so it just made sense when it happened. But you know, nothing changed other than, did they add an attack? I swear it used to either do less attack. Maybe I played before 1.0. I don't know. There's a few of these. So we'll get to them. But anyway, yeah, it used to just give armor to itself. I will say it was like, I guess, usable as a bad tank every now and then, but it's like, you could even compare it to, say, a Husk Hermit, which is already sweeping. It's already 1 cost, and it's a 2 pip unit. And it just already gets 30, so you'd have to wait 3 turns to even get it to the initial health that Husk has, and Husk isn't even necessarily used as a tank most of the time. But here, Steelworker, the only use it has is a tank back then, just a singular tank, and it just sucks at the job, right? But yeah, what an amazing rework for Steelworker. Now it is right up there with some of the best units in the game. Definitely one of the best essences in the game, I think. Dare I say the essence is a bit overpowered, though. I do think that they either need to scale the armor back just a little, maybe to like 3 armor, or I know it sucks, but they probably should make the essence just give the self. Maybe they could have it give just the unit itself armor. We'll give it more than 5, maybe like 10. That could be pretty crazy good. As it stands, it's just too usable of a essence in my opinion, but I'm not going to complain. I'm not necessarily going to complain. I don't think it's overpowered. I think it's just too usable. It just works on everything, and it works so well. You can stick Steelworker's essence on literally anything. And some stuff, it's like really, like obviously with the Apex Imp, it's broken. With the Bogflies, it's pretty good. You know, it splits into 2. Bogfly egg. But yeah, the unit just sucked back then. Really good rework for them to change how that unit worked. Alpha Fiend, funny, because like, you know, there's a slight change there. It now is 25 health. Ooh, that's the only thing that changed for the unit itself. But it is funny because like, the unit has always sucked, but in relation to now, I could still make it work a little bit more as a unit back then. It's really hard to make as a unit work in the DLC, like just as a unit. I will say, because the uncommons were so bad with Hellhorned, it's kind of in the Branded Warrior category. It's either between it or Branded Warrior as the one that was probably the most takeable, which is funny because now they're... I mean, Demon Fiend still is the worst, but... Ugh, yeah, Alpha Fiend's never been good. It was slightly better, though, back then, just simply because look at the choices you have. But I will say, you know, even though the unit itself never got the love that it should have got, the essence is a really good essence. One of the better designed essences in the game. You know, there's a significant cost to adding it, the 1 pip. And especially adding pip to unit without adding health really makes it so it's not going to work in every deck, but there are particular units it's just really good with, right? The most hilarious example is Shadow Eater. And it's not always going to work on Shadow Eater, right? Like, it makes it into a 4-pip unit, which doesn't give you much pip on the floor to work with, so it's often awkward, like the turn you make the infusion, and you kind of have to build into it. But man, once you get it going, that is an amazing unit. There's other ones too, like Sweepers are a good example. You know, just you can miss on rage, but you know, every unit hit with a sweep attack will count as a strike. So you're going to get all those strikes to scale out the sweeper pretty well. Branding rate never changed, but I will say it was better in 1.0 and just pre-DLC. It's still an okay card, but the reason it's better back then is it's kind of twofold. Threefold. I even add threefold. So, but the two main reasons are A, offensively it was usable. It was very flexible in that regard. It was piercing for what that was worth. Wasn't worth much back then, but it did 5 damage. It was a little overcosted for that, but again, 5 damage killed anything in the game that wasn't a purifier. So you had the flexibility to just kill. You know, you could do an easy calculation, like, you know, is this Shadewing gonna do more damage to me than me just killing it? Well, I can flex it over there and kill a Shadewing, or use it to kill Lightwing, whatever the case is. And but even like defensively, you know, 15 armor was just more relevant back then than it is now. It's still like okay to have, but back then that could really, you know, you could play that a few times in your frontliner and that would give you enough to probably beat most Relentlesses. Now that's not going to be enough, right? And then the distant third, I would say just Wrathful Prince benefited from it a lot more back then, and Wrathful Prince just generally was more able to be used on a floor, by endgame at least. It was just really nice. It really synergized with what Wrathful Prince is trying to do, right? It's a revenge trigger, it's more armor, you gain rage naturally from it. It's just everything that a Wrathful Prince wants to have. Inflame, dare I say, was better back then. It's never been good. Never. But again, you can think of it in relation to the other cards, like a Ritual of Battle or a Fledgling Imp. It's still technically like it's getting you more rage to one unit than a Fledgling Imp would. It's double stackable, and keep in mind back then double stack didn't cost an extra ember, so actually like double stack and flame wasn't too bad. I mean, 2 cost and flame, you could even get it down to a 1. Hey, for 1, 8 rage, and even 10 armor back then wasn't too bad. So Inflame was like, it was usable back then. It's still technically usable, it's just, I gotta be in a pretty rough spot to be wanting Inflame in the DLC world. I still maintain, though, that other clans could use this card in their uncommon pool a lot more than Hellhorn could, oddly enough. Like, I would love to have that card in Awoken. I'd be picking it a lot on some of the cursed, like, Awoken Stygian runs or Awoken Umbra runs, right? Where you just miss on all your scaling. And that, I would love to slap an Inflame on an Animus of Will or something. Tiresome Climb, interesting one. I always had trouble evaluating it in 1.0 and like pre-DLC. It never seemed straight up bad, but I was never sure how good it was. And then, even though the card itself hasn't changed, again, the context of just days becoming so much more useful in the DLC made this into a god tier of a card. I think this card's almost always worth adding to your deck when you see it. You know, you can Daze Divinity top floor. It really helps with any boss. You can use it as like pseudo removal. If you must, you can use it to overstack, though I find myself rarely ever using it for that anymore. Yeah, it just became a really good card, even though it never actually changed. I don't know how good it was in 1.0. It never felt amazing. It always felt expensive for what it did. It seemed like I would almost always rather have a hidden passage back then. Now it's kind of the opposite. Battering Ram, I don't know. The card never ever seemed good. It seemed like it should be good, but it just never was good. It was always expensive. It didn't pierce. Even back then, when like there weren't these giant waves, I guess it was technically better than it is now, but just because, you know, in a tough run where you have some armor but maybe you never found much scaling, I guess you can use it to clear the waves, and then maybe simply having enough armor could get you through Relentless. Keep in mind, in 1.0 or pre-DLC, you could beat most bosses, especially like pre-Seraph the Patient. Like, you could kind of get through the game and miss on offensive scaling if you just had crazy defensive scaling. If you could deal with the waves well enough that your pyres survive the waves, you could stack enough defense. You know, regen builds were notorious for this, but you could do it with armor as well. Lifesteal, like you could just stack so much defense that there wasn't enough incoming damage to deal with it from the bosses, and you could just win most Relentlesses. Inferno, there's a card that also never technically changed. It always pierced, it always cost 3, it always did 100 to everybody. I still think it's much better than the DLC. The fact that Value Stone exists, that's the -2 Ember, already makes it a lot more playable. Like, a 1-cost holdover on this is amazing, but even just the necessity for the card in general is needed. You know, you got these, you know, shitloads in Divinity, like half the damn floors all have Spell Shield. They're gigantic. Even the backliners have 20 to 30 health. So an Inferno just cleans all that up. It also softens up like those waves where there's like 3 tanks with like over 200 health. You know, having all their health just does wonders. I still maintain it probably doesn't have a place in all decks. I think it probably gets taken sometimes when it shouldn't. I don't classify it as a card that's like Frenzied Swarm, for example. I feel is almost, or even Tiresome Climb, I feel is almost always a mistake to just straight up skip. Whereas I don't think it's a mistake to straight up skip an Inferno in a lot of decks. You know, sometimes it just doesn't make sense. Like, you can scale well enough on your floor. It just might not make sense in that case. You should just get your other cards in a lot of those cases. And Demon Fiend, it's always sucked. It's worse now. Back then, especially because like keep in mind, Volatile Gauge was busted back then. It went from 0 to 3, kind of like Snecko Eye. But even like the nerfed version of Volatile Gauge, it still was like Demon Fiend, even sketches like Demon Fiend. Like, if you could somehow at all cheat out Demon Fiends, you would win the run in vanilla. You wouldn't even need scaling, really. They could just deal with the entire game, more or less. Now that's obviously not the case. At least it has a minutely usable essence. I don't think it's a great essence, but every now and then it can be okay under like an Animus of Will or a Horned Warrior. But yeah, the unit itself, I just never ever use the unit anymore. Even if I can cheat it out, it's just not good enough. It's like it takes up 3 pip. It doesn't have any utility. 50-50 isn't even that good of stats for the Divine World. So yeah, this unit, even though it technically didn't change, it's gotten worse. They could bring this down to a 3, and I'd still hardly ever take it, but at least you don't have an uncommon unit that is unplayable. Because there's nothing in the common tier of Hellhorn that makes this playable. So I gave praise where praise is due. Those reworks were incredible on pretty much every card that got reworked in Hellhorn so far. I gotta give criticism where criticism is due. I think Demon Fiend is a horribly designed card. It's bad for the game, I think. Just knock it down to 3, keep the stats the same, it's fine. At least it's playable. But I don't know. There's no changes that are going to happen at this point, and that's fine. They've made an incredible game, and flaws here and there are fine. Like, it's not too big of a deal, especially considering how much the other cards of Hellhorn make up for it. Spike the Hellhorn hasn't changed, never been good. Dare I say it's a little more usable in the DLC because of... Keep in mind also, back then, you couldn't put Ember upgrades on X cost cards, so you couldn't do, like, minus the cost on it. To, play it for 0 for something or something. But yeah, now you can put -2 on it. There's also... I think it's just generally good with, like... Well, not generally good. It can be good a little more often with Wormkin in particular, with consumer move and Ember gain mechanics, both within that clan. It still sucks. It's still kind of shitty. Probably the worst spike in a general sense. Dark Deal. It's always been great. You can tell this was not my logbook, because even back then I would have definitely had Dark Deal gilded. I've always thought this is a good card, and honestly, 1.0, this was the primo card of scaling for Hellhorn. I mean, again, think about the other stuff. Fledgling up did 3 rage, Ritual Battle did 6. This gave the most flat rage out of anything that there was, and it costed 0. 7 rage. And not only that, I'd argue, even though, again, the card itself hasn't changed, still a good card, but it was better back then because, A, you could double stack it, it didn't gain in cost. That's not too big of a deal, but more importantly, the 5 damage, just like Branding Right was useful for it. You could use this to kill any backliner in the game other than Purifier. And it was quite useful for that. Especially because, Branding Right had a little bit of redundancy since it's a defensive card, and taking out a backliner is kind of a defensive play. So I kind of like Dark Deal's dichotomy there, right? It's like, am I going to scale my guys offensively, or am I going to do some defensive play by killing the backliner? So it was really cool when that was a choice to make. I really like that aspect of it. It's too bad that hardly ever is a thing now. But still, it's a good card. It's nice that it exists at the rare tier, because so many clans in this game, Awoken in particular, you miss on offensive scaling in the first 2 rings, and now you're fucked. You gotta rely on some miracle or the other clan. Well, Hellhorn never has that problem, because they always have something at all tiers that can offensively scale, and particularly Dark Deal is really nice at that. It doesn't have any prerequisites needed for it to work. Other than you need health on the unit, but if you don't have health on the unit, it's not going to survive Divinity anyway. Alloy hasn't changed. Always been solid. It's probably a little more useful now, because that really high amount of defense is a little more needed. Deranged Brute has changed. I don't know why it needed a buff, because it always was God tier, but for whatever reason it got a buff. Probably should have buffed some of the other units before this one got buffed. So now it does 3 attack per stack. That's the only real change here. It is arguably the best rare in the game. It's definitely my most winning rare. So this clan boasts my 2 highest, at both tiers, uncommon and rare, boasts my highest win rate banner units. Deranged Brute, I mean, it's just a very obvious take if you have any sort of rage at all, and most Hellhorn runs you will. But it was great back then. It was the only unit in the Hellhorn unit that in the Hellhorn arsenal that was actually like good, and it was great, especially after it got the buff to 3. I think it got that buff pretty early too. Like I hardly remember it having just 2 per stack. But yeah, this unit could probably be nerfed back to 2. I could argue you could even nerf it back to 1 and it would still be an amazing unit. Because Resonant Shard is an amazing artifact. Impulate. And also, I think if they nerfed it to 1, they could just actually have the essence be something better. Because you'll never use the range brute essence, you just never will. Impulate hasn't changed, but it is significantly better ever since the Friends and Foes update, because when would you ever have enough imps in your deck in vanilla for Impulate to ever be worth adding? So it's actually a pretty shit card in 1.0, I would say. But you know, once you had the opportunity to have it by default do 5 times 15, you know, 5 Queen Zimplings minimum, now all of a sudden you're doing pretty well. And then you add a few more, and it's doing often 100 damage plus for 1. Pretty decent card, though. I will say, DLC I don't find myself taking it nearly as much as that sweet spot in between Friends and Foes in the DLC. I think that was the best moment for Impulate because that was like a pretty relevant damage at all points in the game. I don't think 100 damage, even like between 100 to even like 150. Isn't necessarily that relevant of damage to frontliners anymore in the DLC world. Transcendent, funny one here. It was 1 cost back then. I think even for a portion of the DLC it was 1 cost. And it's always been great. Even with imps in the weird state that they were kind of in 1.0, it still meant to, if you had any sort of imp going on at all, you'd add a Transcendent because it was going to do pretty well for you. But it certainly wasn't as strong as it got until Friends and Foes. Basically, Shardtail Queen to me really opened up Transcendent as like a just consistently game-breaking unit. And certainly the DLC, the fact that you can put a Queen Zimpling into it is just kind of hilarious. I don't know if they need to like nerf the Queen Zimp essence or not, but it is a little silly how easy it is to win with an endless Transcendent with Queen's Imp. Considering Queen's Imp is just going to be guaranteed in any exiled Hellhorn run to at least have one in the Imp probably by the time you find this. So it is pretty wild. But yeah, it got nerfed to 2 Ember, so that it's not quite as clean to play at all the times, but honestly, if you just have a little bit of know-how, you'll be able to get around that. No problem. You could honestly probably nerf this unit to 3 costs, and it's still pretty broken in the current meta. I think a 3 would actually be a fair cost for the unit, but I'm not going to complain at 2. I like the fact that I can get bailed out of pretty much any run by a Transcendent at any point, pretty much. Then Last Stand, I kind of touched on this one before. The actual text of the card hasn't changed. Still the same, but I just find it was so... It just seemed like a win more card back then. I still would have runs where I'd take it, but it usually was meaning I don't... You know, generally I'm only putting the rage on 1 unit back then. Like I said, like Endless, Rage Imp, Paraffin Enforcer, stuff that just scaled rage widely to the floor, I hardly ever used. So Last Stand didn't really get the whole floor-wide benefit that I get now in the DLC so commonly. But even more importantly, I think you just didn't need that rage. Like, it's like you get to a certain amount of rage and you're killing anything in the game, right? There would be the rare run where Last Stand is how you'd have to get there, and that's when I would add it in 1.0. But honestly, I didn't really like the card in 1.0, but now I think it is easily one of the best cards in the game. My win rate with it is crazy good, with a pretty high take rate. It's not like Transcendent level, but it is definitely the next level for Hellhorn at least, is Last Stand. I actually have I have to check I can't remember which one has the higher actual win rate, because there were a few runs early on in the DLC where I lost with Transcendent that probably brought it down before I really understood how to use the card in such broken ways. Then Reinforce, I've never really liked this card. Every now and then you'll need it in a deck. I think, dare I say, I think it was better pre-DLC. Because, you know, like I said, you could win simply scaling defense, and this is a card that could do it, but I don't know, it's always felt pretty expensive for what it does, and the prerequisites to have an armor, to have a deck that's building off armor for this to make sense is kind of rare for my playstyle. Or more so, to have a deck that builds enough armor that I would need this. So it's kind of a catch-22 here, right? It's also not floor-wide, so it's only one unit, which sucks. I mean, Rage is already better than armor anyway, at least in the DLC world. So yeah, Reinforce, it could probably be like reduced in cost or just go to the whole floor. That could be like a good start to try to get it more takeable. As it stands, I think it's a pretty shit card. I think it's hardly ever worth adding to a deck. Then Hellhorn's Tome. Now I swear I tried to look back through like the patch history, and apparently this has only gone through 2 iterations since 1.0, but that's not how I remember it, Hellhorn's Tome. I swear to God it used to be a 3 cost at one point. I don't know if they initially made it to 3 when they made it fragile, or if it just started out. I swear at some point this was 3 cost, but I guess in 1.0 it was 5. I mean, we can see that here, but it didn't used to apply fragile, which is kind of big, right? You can definitely get it down to 3 easy enough. 110 gold will do that at any Merchant of Magic. And you could just make a unit have multi-strike with no downside. It was kind of broken, even in this 1.0 state at a 5 cost. So the nerf was like definitely warranted. I still think the card, I think, is a well-designed card now. I think they could probably stand to make it like a 4 cost. But I do think the application of Fragile presents an interesting situation where like not every deck can make it work, but enough decks can make it work that I think it's a pretty well-designed card now. It's not overpowered, it's not useless. A lot of people think it's useless. They're just wrong. It's definitely usable. You've probably seen on my channel enough times how it is literally the difference maker in a run where I couldn't find multi-strike. Like I said, Rail Beater, often making its way into my decks. If you miss on multi-strike, you can always hit on a Hellhorn Tome. And for a unit that only has 10 HP, you could almost read it as like, apply multi-strike and minus 10 HP, right? It's almost like a supercharged razor sharp edge at that point. Consumer Crowns, it's always sucked. It sucked even worse back then because Queen's Imps didn't exist, and Imps in general, why would you ever just have a floor of Imps sitting around? There was no Cheater's Hand back then. Cheater's Hand was added, I think, in Wild Mutations or Friends and Foes, one of those two. It is a fucking horrible card. I don't know. It's this and Demon Fiend. The fact that you can get them both is just stupid in a single draft. Like, that just shouldn't be possible. Does Consumer need a buff? I think it does. I think you can stand to nerf Apex Imp and Deranged Brute in the same breath, just to try to even it out a little bit. You got 2 of the most broken rare banners in the game, with probably the worst rare banner in the game, other than maybe Glugsider. I think I can make Glugsider work more than Consumer of Crowns, though. I don't like a card where it has text on it that essentially relegates it to never be used for that actual text. Like, how often are you using Imps to get a Consumer out? You're only taking it if like you started with a Sketches or something, or a Volatile Gauge. So the only reason you take it is to cheat it out. And even then, I don't know. I've had runs where I cheated out, and it's pretty damn underwhelming. It's still a 3-pip unit. Doesn't have that much health for what you're kind of expecting to get from it. And yeah, obviously the damage is good, but if you don't have additional scaling, I could just rather have a Horned Warrior in a lot of cases. So yeah, that is the end of the rares. And that's all the cards. You can see that overall, it's been mainly buffs. If we go back to the start here, which cards got... The only cards that got nerfed, I'm not even going to count anything. So like we kind of talked about some, like March of Shields kind of gets a nerf just because its use is not needed, but I'm not even going to count those. If the text remained the same, I'm not going to count it as a nerf. So on this first page, no nerfs, 1 buff, 2 buffs, 3 buffs, 4 buffs. 4 buffs at this tier. You could also argue this one got buffed twice. So around here, Horned Warrior gets a buff, so 1 buff, 2 buffs with Impressive, Attuned, 3 buffs with Rail Beater. We won't even count Essences, that's just a change for DLC. And then we got another buff here on Steelworker. By the way, no nerfs here. Steelworker gets a buff. Alpha Vein technically gets a buff, 5 HP. Tiresome, nope, yeah, none of these. No nerfs, no buffs other than the first 2 units, which are buffs. And then here, no nerfs, got a buff on Deranged Brute. Don't know why it of these cards needed a buff. I guess we won't say Impolate got a buff just to be consistent. Transcendent got a nerf. One Harm Tome got a nerf. So I guess the rare tier is the only one that actually overall gets a nerf. But realistically, I'd argue that context and whatnot is overall a buff here. And then we get to the final piece that would be present in 1.0, which would be Hellhorn Prince. Or Hornbreaker Prince. It was a pretty good champ back then. It was pretty well designed with how it related to the game. Like, every path was usable. And the math on them just kind of worked out that you had to be a little crafty, especially in like the first 3 rings. I mean, I guess you still do, but I don't know. I miss being able to so consistently have this champ work. It also was like, even after the nerf to One Harm Tome, this unit was, obviously if you got Wrathful, you could get One Harm Tome to be so useful for this champ. But yeah, back then you can see Brawler was essentially the same, though I found myself rarely ever going full Brawler. Definitely full Brawler is something I do more in the DLC, though I even give perhaps a hot take that I think full Brawler is an incredibly overrated path in the DLC. Like, I think that, yeah, it's a bunch of multi-strike, but it's, you know, you technically get a little more armor now, I believe, and not enough for it to be relevant. Fact of the matter is, it doesn't have quick. It's not giving you any utility. It's simply the benefactor of force amplification, which is good for that. But I think that generally you have better options that you'll find in your banners, that Hornbreaker Prince just doesn't occupy a good space. But we won't get too much into the current state of Hornbreaker Prince. We'll just talk about how it was back then, and really, I think the ideal path never changed, really. I think Wrathful 1, Brawler 2 has always been the ideal path, though I will say back then, Reaper 1, Brawler 2 was also pretty usable as a backliner, because you could have a unit with 6 HP generally survive without any extra help. Also, it was just much easier to get the slays, and the actual damage scaling on the slays were much more relevant. You could also go additional points into Reaper, and it kind of made sense in a lot of cases. And Wrathful has just always been a good path. It used to be able to actually self-sustain itself with Spikes, which was like one of the most easiest runs you could do was a Spikes Wrathful run. Because the most damage would usually just be a Light Wing. Sometimes you'd get Shade Wings, but for the most part, you know, you're looking at what, 15 damage? You can gain 15 armor, right, on a sleigh. And in the other sleigh, you're actually gaining armor still. So, yeah, it was a good, definitely a good, man, there's just shit going on in the background. We got, okay, whatever. Y'all know what I'm saying. Y'all know what I'm saying. It doesn't. We all know Hornbreaker Prince. Do I need to say much more? And that is it. That is the Hellhorn clan as it stood in 1.0. I think the clan sucked. I mean, I don't know if I really gave a good picture of how bad the banners were. I mean, think about, like, you go to a Hellhorn banner. What do you What are you gonna get? You're gonna get a branded warrior, a horn warrior, a rail beater, steelworker, an alpha fiend, a demon fiend. That's your likely picks. Look at these units; they're horrible. They were so bad. Now they're great, right? It's like even the units that didn't actually get changed had really usable essences, right? Like branded warrior gets a good essence. Alpha fiend gets an essence. Demon fiend is probably the only one that doesn't get a good essence, but it's still not an unusable essence, right? I think they really glowed up the clan, and it's too bad that you know, the DLC never really got the same long lifespan that the initial game got, because we probably would have seen a similar rework with Umbra, and it probably would have been pretty good, because you know you have to admit, for the most part, they know what they're doing. These were incredible reworks. But you know, there's always Rising Dusk's rebalance patch, which definitely makes a lot of those Umbra units a lot more playable. It just sucks because like using a mod doesn't allow you to do a lot of we can't hold a tournament with the unbalanced mod, right? Or the rebalance mod, right? Because it's a mod and it doesn't really, I don't think we can get it to work online, but at least for the single player you can play and then have that rebalance occur. Anyway, that is it. Hopefully that was fun. I'll probably do the other clans. I'm not in a rush to do those though, because I think the 2 clans that are most changed I've now gone over. The other clans got pretty minute changes compared to these. I mean, these clans arguably just got... you know, if you played in 1.0, you kind of know what I'm talking about. It's hard to... If you missed out on 1.0, it's hard to explain how both these clans, Melting Remnant and Hellhorn, felt back then. The absolute doom of Hellhorn banners and just the absolute, like, dire straits you were in with Melting Remnant a lot of the time are hard to really... Like modern DLC Umbra does not compare, in my opinion. Like, it's not even close to how bad those clans were back then. Anyway, though, as always, thanks for watching, and until next time, peace.